Have you ever felt like you didn't deserve success because of your past mistakes or all of the false or partially true narratives that are out there about you? I've definitely felt like my past would come back to haunt me, and because I've been the villain in some stories, I don't like that I played that role, but the reality is that I did. I feared that if I ever got too big or noticed too hard, that some of these figures would come out and share their version of who I am. And I was afraid of that. And so in honor of confronting that fear and learning how to create our true narratives and live a life that feels true and safe to us, I called this episode Put Your Name on It. And it kind of has multiple themes, because if you were here for the last episode, you might remember that I had no title for this podcast. Not yet, anyway. And I took some intentional time to think about it after that recording, because if you remember what I also mentioned, it was that I wasn't sure what I wanted to call it yet, but as a writing teacher, one thing I would always tell my students is it's best to think of the title at the end when you have a better sense of what it is that you created. And what I think I've created here is a podcast about accepting myself and hopefully in turn helping you accept yourself and show you that your voice has value. And so in honor of that, and in honor of confronting the fear of other narratives coming out, I just wanted to put my name on this one. And I'm going to call it Jenna because, that's my name. So Jenna is the name of my podcast. Put Your Name on It is the name of this particular episode. And as I shared before, it's going to be all about embracing who you are, past and all, and how to confront some of the narratives, whether they come to light or not, that may be circling in your head. And I think a good way to do that, or to begin, would be to connect to my last episode where I talked about how, different parts of my identity and things I'd be discussing on this podcast. I said things like, I am a mother, I am a stepmother, I am a teacher, I am a victim of domestic abuse and of loving someone who was domestically abused. And you'll hear a lot of places that you are not necessarily any one role, right? And those sort of outward roles that define you, those outward roles that maybe you identify with aren't your true identity, right? Your identity is what's at your core, who you are regardless of your external circumstances. Because I wasn't always a mother, I wasn't always a stepmother, I wasn't always a victim of abuse. Those were roles that entered my life later. And although I am not those things, I also am at the same time, and I'll tell you why. We are what we think about. Ultimately, right? What's in our minds is very real and very powerful and eventually makes its way outside. That's sort of a paraphrase of a quote by the wonderful and amazing author Jason Reynolds, or something he alluded to in his book For Everyone. And it is true. We are what we think about, right? Whatever goes on in our minds has a way of coming out. And some of the things I think about the most in this stage of my life are my roles as a mother, teacher, writer, stepmother, victim of abuse, loving someone who was abused. That's what my thoughts sort of ruminate on. And so it does sort of make up who I am because it's what I think about and what I talk about. And it doesn't have to be my forever role. It's just part of who I am now. So on that note, I'm not necessarily going to dive into the abuse part of it today, but what I am going to dive into is some of my work on shame. And from my last episode that I've been reading a lot of Brene Brown's work, and she's a famous sociology professor out of Texas, got really famous from a beautiful TED Talk that she delivered back, I think, in 2010 on vulnerability, and since then has continued to share her wonderful and groundbreaking work about the power of vulnerability. And shame is something that I have long needed to confront, partly because of the religion I was raised with. It was a very shame-based religion. And something I've learned as an adult from Brene Brown's work and also the experiences I have under my belt is that feeling ashamed just leads to more shameful behavior. Because when you internalize shame, kind of makes you think that all you are worthy of is the destructive and embarrassing things that you feel ashamed about. It's not an emotion that encourages you to reach higher or to see yourself in a light of grace. And, to counter it, an emotion that can be productive is guilt, right? Like you did something that hurt someone or hurt yourself or wasn't good, and you feel guilt. That's okay. That's what motivates you to change. But guilt is something where it's like you feel it, you recognize that you shouldn't engage in whatever that behavior is, you make a change and you move on. Shame is something that follows you and attaches to your identity. And for a long time, I was afraid to put my name on it. And by it, I mean everything I've created, all of the stories that I'm proud of that are on my website. I was afraid to put myself out there too much in case someone from my past saw me and said, "What a fraud you are. You're not who you say you are. What about this? What about that?" And I have a feeling that all of you are probably no strangers to people using your past against you. It's a really, really common move to shame people for those reasons. And the problem is when people shame you for something that you're already embarrassed about, you just internalize more and more that you're not deserving of the good things that you hope for yourself, of your dreams, of your higher paths. And so today I wanted to just face the two things that I am the most ashamed of, and hopefully my facing them will help you to maybe reframe some of the things that you feel ashamed of. So here I go. I'm going to just name what the two things are. And, in planning this, I felt okay, like I can do it, but I need you to know that I am very afraid right now, which is why I'm sort of dancing around it and putting it off. I'm afraid, but I'm going to just dive in anyway alongside that fear, because never do any of us approach anything perfectly. And if we did, it would probably come across as inauthentic. And authenticity is really the only thing that leads to change. So here we go. The number one thing, number one and two, and they're kind of tied for different reasons, that I am ashamed of and that I was afraid of facing, if I were ever to get too big, was a narrative about me when I first became a teacher, that I tried to fill in too much of a counselor role, and I crossed boundaries with some of my students. And by that, I just mean I knew too much about their personal struggles and would try to help in areas that were not my place to help. And I didn't like being perceived as somebody who crossed boundaries, in that way, because it was never my intention. And so part of this episode will be about how I learned to not look back on my early years as a teacher in shame, but to kind of reframe it. So I'm going to address that one first. But before I do, I'm going to give you a little preview to the second one. And that one is just straight up cheating on my first husband, right? Isn't cheating the most shameful thing out there? Far more people engage in it than you would think. I mean, you'd be surprised how many people actually cheat behind closed doors, but maybe that's a conversation for another day. But I was ashamed for cheating on my first husband, and I don't like that I am probably the villain in his story. I don't like that I'm probably the villain in his family's story, and I feel awful about it, right? And I was ashamed for a long time. Nobody ever gets married, or I would say very few people get married and think, I can't wait to have an affair someday. That's not why you go into anything. So once I address the teaching issue, then I'll talk about that whole cheating issue. Again, all with the end goal of hoping that my journey can encourage you too. So to circle back to the teaching issue, like I said, I was perceived by some families and staff as crossing boundaries because I tried to fill into too much of a counselor role. There were some families that made that argument, and I was an English teacher, right? English is all about writing and reading and putting your soul out there. And as a young 25-year-old teacher, because I was only 25, and I can say now as someone in my mid-30s, don't know shit in your 20s. Your 20s is all about figuring things out. It's kind of crazy that this culture popularizes youth so much because you don't know anything in your youth. Your youth is all about learning. And I'm so much more proud of who I am now, but I wouldn't have become that person without my 20s, but that's kind of a segue. So to circle back, I was a 25-year-old teacher, and what I found is that I was very good at creating community in my classroom, a space where people felt safe communicating their ideas and sharing, their heart and their writing. And when you're young and you see that you have this gift, but nobody really teaches you how to use it properly, you start to, of course, maybe cross some of those boundaries sometimes. And, a student writes a story about something difficult that they've been through, and then they come and talk to you about it. And next thing you know, you're in it, and you don't know that balance between being polite and respectful and honoring their vulnerability, but also redirecting them to maybe the more appropriate professional source, such as the counselor. So on one end, I was criticized by some families for that, but also praised by other families, for some clubs that I led, like the Sci-Fi Fantasy Book Club, or just some classes that I taught that encouraged students to read. I had some families saying to me that it was the first thing their child had ever been involved in all 4 years of high school. And finally, there's a place where they can feel connected. And they were so grateful to me for creating that for them. And so nothing is typically all bad or all good. Usually there's an in-between. But, eventually when I left that teaching job and I looked back in shame. I thought, oh God, I don't want to be perceived as inappropriate. That was never my intention as a teacher, to become a counselor. And for a long time, I just wouldn't even think about that period of time because I didn't like the narrative that was maybe out there for some, but also the story I was telling myself, which is that I crossed too many boundaries. I was bad. I was a bad teacher. On the other side of actually learning what some of these words like shame and grace really mean, I was able to reframe my past a little bit. And I hope, this is the part of the story that I really hope you listen to, because if you're like me and you've never really understood what grace means, people say give grace, have grace, but what does it actually mean to do that? I can tell you what it means to do that, at least from my experience. So I looked back on myself, that 25-year-old, and I used to just be ashamed of her. I used to think I was undeserving of even teaching anymore because I wasn't good at balancing helping and directing to another party. I didn't have that balance. But instead, I looked back once I started this work on shame and really thinking about it. And I saw a 25-year-old who went into teaching hoping to help, hoping to create a more just world, hoping to create a space where students could find their own voices, build their own voices, and make the world better with their stories, with their fight for equality. And I did that. Even imperfectly, I did that. And I was able to see myself not as somebody who was just inappropriate, but as somebody who had a gift but was never properly taught how to balance that. Because guess what? In teacher school, they don't tell you what to do if you're good. And if you get kids to start talking and writing, what do you do then? There was no class on balancing how much you listen and help and how much you redirect. And I did indeed learn it the hard way. I learned those boundaries by upsetting people, by realizing, oh, okay, that was maybe too much. I shouldn't have helped there, or, I should have directed. And my teaching career didn't end at 25. I went on to teach for several more years, and I was better at those boundaries. I was better at redirecting. I knew my role and when it was time to help, and I knew when it was time to redirect. And I never would have learned that had I not made that mistake. And I was also able to see that what I was trying to do is build a community in my classroom. And I would make the argument that all of us long for community. That's why so many of us have holiday celebrations, right? Where the family gets together, we eat, we dance, we talk, we play games. We want to be connected. There's all kinds of events, throughout the year where people, whether it's work-based, family-based, neighborhood-based, where people are trying to connect with each other and feel seen, feel heard. How many support groups, book clubs, all that stuff. People are always trying to connect. And that's what I was trying to do. When I look back on that time, I was just trying to build a community. And I did that. And I am confident that there are several of my students who went on to hopefully do beautiful things because they experienced during that time what it felt like to express themselves, to feel safe expressing themselves. So reframing is the key to actually, although it's like wincing first, it's like an open wound to look at the things that you're the most ashamed of. It's encouraging to look back at that time and reframe it and go, you know what? It wasn't just shame. I felt some guilt at the time because I probably did cross some boundaries and help students with things that were not my job to help them with. But I was trying to build community, and I learned from it, and I went on to do better. I realized that I was making some mistakes, and I learned, and I changed my approach to teaching to a point where I did find that good balance, and I learned how to help kids with their writing and their college plans and all of that stuff, and I learned when to direct them to the counselor. I learned from it, and that's the best that anybody can do, is to learn from it. And so it takes time, to start to really, when you think of those memories, change how you feel about it. But slowly, I keep reminding myself, each time that twinge of shame comes up, it's like I repeat the words community and learning, because instead of feeling ashamed, I now see myself as someone who is learning and who did learn and who did better once they knew better, and who at her heart, just was trying to create a safe space, which is ultimately what educators want to do. And that's what I did. So if you're somebody who has a period of time, maybe it is with a job, maybe it's with something else where you're embarrassed at how things ended, or you're embarrassed or ashamed about how you feel like you performed in that particular space, just give yourself a minute. Even if it hurts or it's cringy at first, give yourself a minute to just look at it and think, what were my intentions? What did I learn? And how did I do better? Try to see yourself from an outside view and really just sit with it for a little bit. And then continue to remind yourself of how you have reframed that. Because I can tell you that it haunted me. Even though it's been 11 years since then, it really haunted me and impacted what I thought I deserved as an educator. So again, just take some time. Take some time with whatever it is that you are ashamed of and reframe it. To me, that's ultimately what grace means, is it's taking the time to reframe something. And it's something you can do for yourself, but also for your relationships. If there's someone who you love who messed up and they're apologetic and they're wanting to learn from it, but you're still having a hard time letting it go, when you're in the right space, to have grace means reframing maybe the why, reframing the place that they were in when they did that. All of it's easier said than done, but the more you do it, the more you can live from a place of learning and grace and less from a place of shame. Because as I've said, what I've been learning from my own experiences as well as Brene Brown's work is that shame just leads to more shame and more shameful choices because we don't think that we deserve more. And on that note, that leads perfectly into the second thing that I was ashamed of, which is cheating on my first husband. And I'm going to tell you, I genuinely believed, I was around the same age when all of this happened, actually, the same as when I was making some mistakes with teaching. When I fell in love with my first husband, I genuinely believed that I was in love. And prior to that, I had made some, what I thought then were mistakes. I was raised and went to school in a place where the definition of success was getting married, ideally getting married in your early to mid-20s, having children, and making sure that you went to church and got involved with church. And if you didn't meet those expectations, then you just failed. And I had had a baby before I got married. I'd had a baby with a dangerous person and was very much shamed by those around me for doing that. And when I fell in love with my first husband, he was very much the opposite of the father of my child, and that's partly why I chose him. I felt relieved, and I felt like I was fulfilling an expectation of me that I needed to have the proper family, and I thought that I was building the proper family. Well, not too far into it, I found myself unhappy. I had pursued all of the things that I was supposed to pursue, right? I finally had it all. I had the marriage, I had the babies, I had the house, but I was not happy. And it turned out that, my first husband, we just simply were not right for each other. I was too busy looking at him from the lens of a life that I thought I should pursue, but wasn't actually my life. And it wasn't going to lead to any sort of happiness. I thought it would, but it wasn't defined by my standards. Like many people, I felt trapped, and I started making self-destructive choices to have affairs and to be dishonest and to live dishonestly because I, at the time, did not feel like I had anybody who I could go to and say, this isn't working. And I guess that's not entirely true. I tried with a couple people, but they just didn't really take it seriously. Nobody really reflected with me, and I, of course, felt like I couldn't even go to certain people because divorce is off the table. It's out of question. How dare you even consider that? And then there's also the fears that many people have of losing the house, losing the money, losing the security, not knowing what's going to happen. And so I just made self-destructive mistakes in the shadows. And for a long time, I was so ashamed of that because it all came to light. You know what I mean? It does. Everything does. The fact that I had an affair came out. And I'm going to say this, I absolutely feel guilty about all of that. Although I learned from it, I, of course, don't condone any of this because I hurt someone, right? So by talking about my journey of healing from it and giving myself grace for it, I am by no means excusing it. I hurt someone. This isn't the right way, if you want to call it that, to find out what your path should be by hurting others. And I never intended to, right? Like I said before, nobody gets married with the intention of having an affair. I never imagined I would do that. I thought I was in love. I thought I was doing the right thing. But then slowly everything just started to feel wrong. And so for me, the reframing for this situation, the other thing that I feel the most ashamed of, the reframing all centers on the fact that maybe my self-destructive behavior, the self-destructive acts of having affairs, lying, all that stuff was a mirror to show me that the life I was living was destructive. That living in this picture of church, family, marriage, just for the sake of checking those boxes was destroying who I really was. And it was not the life that was meant for me. And I was not meant to remain trapped. And I don't think anybody is. So although I don't recommend, necessarily self-destruction for learning, it's the reality of what happened. I did things that just hurt me because having affairs didn't feel good. As much as people try to tell you it does, it doesn't. I didn't like living dishonestly. I was not meant to live dishonestly. It felt awful. It really did. But it showed me that I was not in the life that I was meant to live, whether it was the affair or the marriage that I should have never entered into. It wasn't right for me. And just like my teaching experience, I did not make a lifestyle out of acting that way. It took a while to learn that lesson, but I got divorced. I moved on. I built something else, and I eventually arrived to a place where now I just live vulnerably and openly, and I don't feel the need to lie anymore because I finally feel like the person who I really want to be is safe to be. And I just mean somebody who has my own values, somebody who sees that maybe just checking off the church, marriage, children boxes is not what you need to be a successful human being. So again, to repeat that grace, and what does it mean to actually have grace for yourself? It's to look back at, again, I was in my mid-20s, look back at that person and not just see this person who should be ashamed that she had an affair and got divorced and all that, but to instead see somebody who was trying to fight for the life that was really meant for them, the life that was best for her and probably best for my ex now, because I don't think that he would want to still be married to me anyway. Again, I I don't condone what happened. I wish it wouldn't have happened, but the reality is that it did. And I'm not proud that I hurt people. I'm really not. But the reality is that I did. And all I can do now is look back on it and go, okay, did I learn from it? Yes, I did. Did some of those very self-destructive acts give me insight into maybe others who are hurting and making self-destructive choices who I can now help? Yes, it did. I've heard two of my favorite podcasters who I've mentioned on this show already, Jay Shetty and Ed Milet. They talk frequently about you are most qualified to help the person that you used to be. And some of your most self-destructive, embarrassing moments could be the very thing that help you help someone else or help you make the world better. And so where I'm at is trying to no longer be ashamed of things, but to look back on and help myself understand why. And then to take that why and reframe it to a place of grace and recognize that I didn't stay in that place. See, I can't help but be a poet. To recognize that I did learn from it and I built something better. And maybe those very things will be the things that can help me help other people. They certainly gave me insight into some of my novels. Although many of my stories are fictional, they're based on real life things. And as somebody who was involved in an affair, you start to get insights about why they happen. And I think there's a lot of affairs that are happening out there. There certainly are, I've heard a lot of stories, direct stories from people in them. And the primary reason they do it is because they feel trapped, because they think they'll lose the security, quote unquote, that they have if they leave or if they start something else, or they just entered into a marriage for the wrong reasons where they felt that they had to, rather than evaluating if it was right for them. And so perhaps some of my experience will be the very thing that can help other people. And I'll maybe end on this note. Again, sort of the combination of everything that I'm studying right now is that, it's hard to not judge other people, right? It's hard sometimes. We judge people all the time. And it's hard, for me in particular, as someone who's felt very judged my whole life, I then naturally judge other people. And what I've learned is that the best way to be more understanding and compassionate to others rather than judgmental is to learn how to be understanding and compassionate to ourselves. And I have certainly found that the more that I learn to look on myself and my past with compassion rather than judgment, certainly the better I've become at not judging others, at seeing their circumstances and their intentions, or sometimes just fucking listening because nobody asked me to be their judge. They just asked me to listen. And so on that encouraging note, I want to tell you that all of the internal work that you do, whether that's facing shame, rebuilding yourself, leaving the situation that isn't good for you, whatever it is, whatever the internal work that you're doing to make those decisions and to face those emotions, it always comes outward. Right? Just like our mistakes and our destructive things always eventually have an outward effect on others, so does the good work that we do inside, the work to get to know ourselves, to be compassionate to ourselves. It all spills outward. And so I want to encourage you again that whatever you're doing inside will naturally flow to people outside. And I promise, as difficult as it is to live vulnerably, I wholeheartedly agree with Brené Brown's work that that's the only way that we experience grace, joy, even true sadness that can lead to healing. It's the only way. And so I am putting my name on this one, just like I'm putting my name on my podcast, which is Jenna, because this is all about my journey and the hopes that my journey and my thoughts will help you too. And for all of you listening, I want to encourage you to put your name on it, the it being anything and everything. Don't be afraid to face the thing that you're ashamed of. Reframe it for yourself. Learn from it. Don't believe that some of those false narratives about you are your whole story, because if you can confront the narrative for yourself, it's much easier to let the fact that that narrative exists, to let it go. because you know that you're so much more than that. And people tell themselves stories all the time. The most important one is the story that you tell about yourself. So put your name on it. I wish all the best for you, and that you'll also be putting your names on your dreams, your hopes, and your ambitions. And it is my hope that you can take this sort of, I don't know, pot that I've stirred, for maybe lack of better words, and get something from it that will motivate you. Thank you for your time today, and I will talk to you soon.